take-home test. I can guarantee it. Between Symbolab, Photomap, and Wolfram Alpha,
Symbolab is
my favorite.
I
I use Symbolab.
yes, but see, I actually do the work and Symbolab like check.
I think mine last night.
All right.
I got the number.
Pull up the notes that sent out this morning. Well, I got about 15 minutes of notes. All right. Then I got a worksheet that kind of like covers like what we're talking about. So we'll be done prep early here. So we're going to finish up chapter. All right. And so yesterday we were you trying to say like we were talking about how the Reformation kind of like was spread to other parts of Europe. And so I kind of explained like how like the kind of Reformation in kind of different areas and stuff like that were kind of like you have like top-down kind of reforms where they mainly kind of from a king, like in Scandinavia, with King Vasa of Gustav Vasa of Sweden, and then later Christian III of Denmark. They kind of continued Lutheranism. Whereas they kind of looked at it as a means to try to maintain kind of money within, wealth within Scandinavia rather than sending it to Rome. In England, it was not. It was basically one man not getting a divorce. That kind of led to the creation of the Anglican Church. And then we have like more grassroots kind of reform, like Switzerland, for example, one more based on theology. And then they're throwing that conflict between. Essentially kind of rural and city, Scotland and stuff. So the map of kind of Europe when it comes to religion here in kind of Europe at the time in the mid-1500s, you see like kind of like in the dark blue, that's where Lutheranism took root. So you have much of like what is essentially the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, Scandinavia. And then you have like kind of Calvinism, right, which was established by John Calvin. In Switzerland, parts of France, Scotland, which John Knox kind of established that. But still, the majority of those, like in places like Spain and Italy and most of France and parts of Poland, Ireland, and that are primarily Roman Catholic. So you probably have to probably about 75% of Western Europe, or Europe at the time was probably still, with the exception of kind of Southeastern Europe, was still about 75% still Catholic, about 25% or so Protestant. But the Catholic Church's monopoly on people's everlasting soul and all that stuff has been broken. All right, and so the Catholic Church really has to at least acknowledge this, and to a certain extent, maybe answer to some of their critics, and that leads to what they refer to as the Counter-Reformation, which is essentially the Catholic Church's attempt to, in some sense, initially kind of reform itself, or at least kind of answer to their critics. Thank you. And then, in reality, what ends up happening is they're just basically kind of entrenching their already pre-existing ideas. All right, so this is the Catholic Church answering to the kind of the Protestant Reformation. Answers in some case maybe like trying to make a change a little bit of things, but other ones basically kind of entrenching its already pre-existing ideology and stuff. All right, so one of the things as far as reform goes, and I'm kind of a softer sell to try to kind of combat Protestantism. Was the emergence of the kind of new orders again, like we had talked about the Franciscans and the Dominicans during the kind of like the High Middle Ages here. Probably the most famous kind of order that emerges out of this kind of period of the Counter-Reformation is the Society of Jesus, more commonly known as the Jesuits, which is still around today. The founder of the Jesuit order is a guy named Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius was a nobleman. He was a priest as well as he fought. He was within the Spanish army. He fought in Italy. It was in Italy when he got injured there while he was kind of laid up in the infirmary in the hospital. He started to immerse himself back into kind of like a church, kind of Bible, kind of Catholic writings and such. And so he kind of writes a kind of how-to book for Catholics called Spiritual Exercises, the importance of prayer, but also the importance of kind of deeds and stuff like that. Along with Ignatius, there's St. Teresa of Avila, who is another writer kind of promoting kind of Catholic doctrine, but a little bit more kind of like progressive in that sense. So, like I said, this is probably of the Counter-Reformation, probably the thing that's the most lasting is the establishment of the Jesuits. There's Ignatius, apparently had an issue with male pattern baldness. All right. So the goal of the Jesuits, essentially at three kind of goals. One is education. All right, and this kind of mixing of kind of like religious as well as kind of humanist kind of education, more kind of like a mixing of philosophy and stuff like that. And that's still the goal of the Jesuits today. The Jesuits have established schools all over the world. Like, for example, St. Louis University is a Jesuit school. There's a lot of Loyolas, which are named basically after Ignatius. There's Loyola in Chicago, one in New Orleans, one in California, one in Maryland. Creighton University in Omaha is a Jesuit school. Xavier in Cincinnati. The number of high schools met slew high in that. So that's still part of their kind of mission. Another one was to kind of coincided with the kind of age of exploration. A number of them, particularly like in France, you had Jesuits that went to Illinois, the Illinois region here, that administered to the Illini. Marquette, one of those being Marquette from Marquette and Joliet, was a kind of a Jesuit missionary. The one criticism of them, though, and this is that in certain parts of the New World, they used slave labor in certain cases when they would establish kind of agricultural settlements. But then the idea was to kind of like a softer sell to prevent the spread of Protestantism, right? So like I said, the Jesuits like are still around, and this is like particularly number one is kind of main goal of theirs. However, most of the Counter-Reformation is kind of spearheaded by popes, right? And essentially, there's 4 popes during this period that marks the Counter-Reformation. The pope at the beginning of that is Pope Paul III. He's the one who basically approved of the kind of the order of the Jesuits. But Paul is pretty conservative religiously. Although I mentioned him, he was the pope at the time when Michelangelo was painting the Last Judgment on the back of the Sistine Chapel. And his master of ceremonies was that guy Chesna, who was very critical of the use of nudes there. So Michelangelo put Chesna in at the very bottom right as Midas put a donkey ears on him and had a serpent basically kind of wrapped around him and kind of basically clutching onto a very sensitive area of his anatomy. When Chesna went to Paul and basically said, hey, can you have him remove this? And he's like, well, because he's located in the painting in hell. He's like, that's not my realm. My realm is heaven and kind of earth, not hell. Paul, though, does open up the kind of the Inquisition to those who are Protestants. All right. This is his portrait painted by Titian, who I talked about, one of the kind of artists that we talked about who kind of came from the School of Venice. This is another portrait painted of Paul a little bit later by Titian of Paul and his grandsons. All right. So the grandson to the right became a cardinal. The grandson to his left is the Duke of Parma, where we get Parmesan from. All right. You may be asking yourself, how the hell does the Pope have grandchildren? All right. Well, again, this is the idea where kind of the Catholic Church kind of lends itself to some criticism here. We have a number of popes like Alexander VI and Leo X, who are kind of basically kind of in the open, having kind of wives and mistresses and children, if you will. So that is one of the criticisms that, while there are people that address this, the popes at the top weren't really too concerned about it. But we consider him the kind of originator, or at least at the beginning of the Counter-Reformation, because he's the one who's going to call this ecumenical council called the Council of Trent. It's in Trento in Italy, but the Anglicized kind of name for Trento is Trent. All right. So this was a meeting of the College of Cardinals, various bishops around there, other kind of church officials, to address matters pertaining to the criticism of the Protestant Reformation. It convenes in 1545, and it lasts about 18 years, off and on. It's not continuous. But we essentially have 4 popes at that time in that 18-year period here. All right. And so, again, periodically these guys are kind of brought back to Trent. At one point, I think it was moved to another part in Italy, but it's still kind of like it comes back to Trent. This is kind of a portrait of the kind of the meeting there. So what was decided there was really essentially, rather than reform, was really basically just kind of adhering to already kind of existing church doctrine. Right. One big thing was that the Pope's interpretation of the Bible is final. This is in response to the kind of Protestant kind of idea, Lutheranism, Calvinism, that the Bible is the final authority. Here, the Bible is included, but it's the Pope's interpretation of the Bible. Right. The other one was salvation, meaning kind of entrance into heaven was to acquire through faith as well as good works. For Protestants, it was just faith alone. All right. The other one was the Bible and church are equal authority. So this is where the Protestants basically argue that the Bible is final authority. All right, here it kind of puts the church and particularly the Pope on equal plane there. And then the concept of indulgences, which essentially is what started. Oh, I got a phone call. Hello? Yes, he is. Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you. All right, bye-bye. So indulgences, those certificates that were basically sold to, like, and again, the idea with those indulgences, those saying was, you were exempt from the Hail Marys and Our Fathers, right? Whereas that guy like John Tetzel made the idea is that your sin is completely forgiven from that. The kind of it determined indulgences were still valid, but they were a narrower definition, or the kind of true definition. And then other expressions, like for example, like the use of relics, were still kind of valid here. All right, so there's not a lot of reform that was kind of after these 18 years that were basically kind of, it was basically the Catholic Church saying, you know what, yes, we hear the critics, but screw you, we're basically going to continue how we kind of operate here. All right, this doesn't do anything to really bring Catholics and Protestants together. It still does kind of have a lot of tension here. And then the Pope at the very end of the Council of Trent, the one who kind of basically kind of ends it there, is Pope Paul IV. Paul is his kind of contribution here, and like you know, his namesake before him, he's very conservative. Matter of fact, he was the one who had basically advocated kind of repainting over some of the nudes that Michelangelo had on the ceilings of the Sistine Chapel and that. He actually, one of his first actions was to rescind the pension of Michelangelo for basically kind of painting all those nudes there. I think that was rescinded as well. But Paul's kind of contribution here was basically kind of signing off on a thing called the Index of Forbidden Books, which is the compiling of various kind of works, written works that were kind of against kind of like church doctrine there. Now, obviously, some of these, you're going to have all the writings of Martin Luther, John Calvin, all these other Protestant reformers. But this is where we start to see the church and science having a kind of contentious relationship. All right, like for example, later Galileo is going to be put on this, and Galileo is going to be put on trial and face house arrest. Galileo was kind of advocating, like Copernicus advocated for, was that heliocentric model of the universe, where we know the sun is at the center of the universe. The Catholic Church at the time was basically saying, because God created man in his own image, that Earth was at the center of the universe. Isaac Newton was put on this. This lasted up until 1992, just to give you an idea. All right. So and there's like some issue here where science and kind of religion at times can be somewhat kind of like at odds, and that's because of this. Paul is also going to kind of open up something called the Roman Inquisition, where it's somewhat anti-Semitic. Jews were kind of forced around Rome to wear the Star of David, the kind of gold Star of David, which is going to be basically brought back when the Nazis take over in Europe during the Holocaust. So moving back to kind of like what's the political climate here. Like I said the other day, Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, as well as Netherlands, Naples. He's probably kind of the strongest monarch, but he spends a lot of time on military campaigns. He's at war with the French quite frequently. He's in war in Italy. At one point, he had to go fight the Ottomans. All right, so he spends a lot of time on kind of military campaigns. While fighting the Ottomans, the kind of Lutheran state in Germany kind of formed their own alliance called the Schmalkaldic League, named after the city in which it was signed. In 1547. Hey, what's going on? People coming in and out. Yeah. What we did. Like a cocktail party. So the Schmalkaldic League in 1547 takes on Charles V once he's like done with kind of dealing with the Ottoman Sultan. And there was a battle in Germany called the Battle of Mulberg. Now, the battle itself is really insignificant. Charles's forces basically spanked the Schmalkaldic League. But the deal is that no Catholic German princes fought alongside Charles V. They didn't want to fight their fellow countrymen, per se. So while as essentially Charles wins the battle, he ultimately loses the war, because what he's trying to do is basically just put the genie back in the bottle. Right? And it's after the Battle of Mulberg where it's absolutely clear that Protestantism is here to stay within the Holy Roman Empire. All right, so about 8 years later or so, he essentially signs off on something called the Peace of Augsburg. Augsburg is an important city in Lutheran faith. It's the second oldest city in Germany, named after Augustus. But Augsburg, there was something called the Augustana Confession, or the Augsburg Confession, which is basically the confession of faith for Lutheranism, lays out kind of like the basic kind of tenets of Lutheranism. There's a college up in Rock Island called Augustana. That's a Lutheran college that was named after that. We were in Augsburg in 2006. Me and Chap took students over there. It was the World Cup, and we stayed in Augsburg, and it's a prime example of a split between Catholic and Lutherans. There's a family called the Fugaries there that were kind of a merchant family. They're devout Catholics. Even today, they have something where basically, if Catholics are down on their luck, they could go live in this kind of like, it's a pretty nice, we walked through there, pretty nice kind of like a estate, like for $2 a month or something like that. We were in a church in Augsburg that on one side of the church was a Catholic like kind of church, and the other side was Lutheran, like literally in the same building there. All right. So essentially what the Peace of Augsburg was essentially what was decided at the First Diet of Speyer in 1526. So German kind of princes, dukes, and stuff like that could either be Lutheran or Catholic. They can't be Calvinist. They can't be Anabaptist. It's not until the kind of after the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, where Calvinism was kind of accepted in what was the Holy Roman Empire. This is going to be very tenuous, and then completely falls apart in the early 1600s when the 30 Years' War starts. Right? But after this, Charles V is essentially exhausted. Right? And so what he ends up doing, he basically abdicates the next year. All right? So he steps down. His son, Philip II, becomes king of Spain. The Philippines are named after him. All right? He continues his father's war in Italy. Philip later marries Mary Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. So they're essentially cousins. When she dies without child, Philip offers to marry her successor, Queen Elizabeth, but Elizabeth refuses because she was staunch Protestant, and that's when the kind of Spanish were planning the invasion. That's when I was telling you about Mary, Queen of Scots. She was corresponding with the Spanish under Philip II, and then the Spanish started invading England with the Spanish Armada, and then his brother Ferdinand takes the Holy Roman Empire title. What ends up happening is that Charles then essentially retires to a monastery. He dies a few years later, I think in 1559. All right, so he spent about 40 years trying to combat the spread of Protestantism, and to no avail. All right, so there's Philip. All right, Philip II, and there's Ferdinand. Notice the kind of Habsburg chin thing there, the kind of J Lotto chin that those guys all have. All right, so that's chapter 12, basically. So what I got here, I sent out kind of a worksheet. It's essentially two worksheets into one. The first one is a map on basically the various kind of like Protestant denominations, and you have a chart there. Now, question number one, I kind of gave you that answer when I was talking about the notes. It says approximately what percentage of Europe and west of the Ottoman Empire, right here, was Catholic, what percentage was Protestant? Catholic is all white here, right? So the idea of Catholic right here, and then you had the kind of the Protestant in the kind of shaded areas. It doesn't come out and say it to you, but like I said, I would type down 75% Catholic, 25% Protestant, all right? So I gave you the answer for the first one. And then on the second question, it says, look at the list of towns and cities in the chart, locate each town or city on the map, circle Protestant towns in blue, Catholic towns in red. Don't need to circle that stuff. What I got here, there are essentially 7 cities, all right? So like find them like Wittenberg right here, find it on the map, it's up kind of here in the Holy Roman Empire. If it's Protestant, put P. If it's Catholic, put C, all right? So you got some cities here, all right? They just kind of got to locate them on the map. All right, if it's Protestant, P, if it's Catholic, C. All right, and then on the timeline, just answer the questions based on the kind of the years there. Like question 4, what happened in 1533 that led to the Church of England separating from Rome? Kind of go up there, you find 1533, Henry VIII annuls his marriage. All right, so that would be your answer. So this shouldn't take you too long. All right. Does anybody have any questions or concerns? Problems?
Oh.